Right now, in a part of the United States where the ground almost never moves, scientists are trying to figure out exactly what just happened underneath it. At 5:21 in the morning, on July 23, 2026, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Texas Panhandle, in a rural stretch of Roberts County, about 24 miles south-southeast of the town of Spearman, and roughly the same distance northwest of the town of Miami. Within minutes, people were feeling it in Amarillo, then in Lubbock, then, remarkably, all the way into Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Oklahoma, hundreds of miles away. The United States Geological Survey estimates that around 103,000 people felt light shaking, and another 640,000 felt at least a weak version of the tremor. And here is the detail that has seismologists paying very close attention. This is one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in the history of the Texas Panhandle, a region that, geologically speaking, is not supposed to shake like this at all. No injuries, no reported damage. But a very real scientific mystery about why the ground in the middle of Texas just moved this hard, and whether it is about to happen again. Today we are going to break down exactly what happened, why this region almost never produces earthquakes like this, and what scientists actually think is causing it. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the data, and the real investigation underway right now. Drop a comment right now. Did you feel this one? Whether you were in Amarillo, Lubbock, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, or anywhere else in the region, tell me exactly where you were and what it felt like. If you want to be the first to know every time a story like this develops, subscribe to Stellar Zone right now. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm actually shows it to the people who need to see it. Thank you. Now, let us get into it. It is worth pausing on why a single number, magnitude 5.0, generates this much scientific attention in the first place, because we have covered this before on this channel, and the same math applies here. The magnitude scale used by the USGS is logarithmic, not linear. Each whole number increase represents roughly 10 times more ground motion and around 31 times more energy released. That means a magnitude 5.0 earthquake is not simply a little stronger than the magnitude 3 and 4 tremors this region occasionally produces without anyone noticing. It represents dramatically more energy, which is exactly why it was the one event capable of waking people up in Amarillo and Lubbock and rattling windows as far away as Tulsa, Oklahoma, while the smaller background earthquakes this region has always quietly produced go completely unnoticed outside of scientific instruments. This is also why seismologists do not treat a jump from magnitude 4 to magnitude 5 as a rounding error. It is the difference between an event nobody feels and an event that gets reported by hundreds of people across multiple states within minutes. Let us start with the basic facts, confirmed directly from the United States Geological Survey. The earthquake struck at 05:21 local time, 10:21 UTC, on July 23, 2026. The epicenter was located in northwestern Roberts County, in the Texas Panhandle, at a depth of just 5.7 kilometers, about 3.5 miles below the surface. That depth matters enormously, and if you have followed this channel before, you already know why. A shallow earthquake, one that originates close to the surface rather than deep underground, delivers far more of its energy directly upward, with almost no rock layer to absorb and dampen it before it reaches the people and structures above. That is exactly why a relatively rural earthquake in the Texas Panhandle was still felt as far away as Tulsa, Oklahoma. Local news outlets covering the region confirmed reports of shaking not just in nearby towns but across a wide radius spanning multiple states, and hundreds of individual reports were submitted directly to the USGS Did You Feel It system in the hours afterward. Now here is why this earthquake is such a big deal, even though nobody was hurt and no buildings came down. The USGS itself immediately flagged this as historically significant. According to their own catalog, this was the strongest earthquake ever recorded in the Texas Panhandle since at least 1900, and only the fourth earthquake of magnitude 4.0 or higher in that region across more than a century of record-keeping. A separate historical chronology maintained by the National Weather Service office in Amarillo frames it slightly differently, identifying it as the fourth earthquake at or above magnitude 5.0 in the Panhandle since 2011 specifically, and noting that nearly 91% of every known earthquake in the region since 1907 fell below that magnitude 5.0 threshold entirely. Two respected institutions, two slightly different historical catalogs, and yet both arrive at the same underlying conclusion from two different angles. Whichever way you slice the data, this earthquake sits in a tiny, exclusive club of panhandle seismic events, and there are only a small handful of entries in that club across more than 100 years of recorded history. Let us look at exactly who else is in that club, because the history here tells its own story. Going back through the record, an earthquake near the town of Panhandle in 1925 is generally regarded as the benchmark event for the region, with different catalogs placing its magnitude anywhere from 4.9 to 5.4, depending on which historical methodology you use, a common issue with earthquakes recorded before modern seismic instrumentation existed. Then came an earthquake near Borger in 1936, estimated around magnitude 5.0. Then an earthquake near Dalhart in 1948, estimated between magnitude 4.5 and 5.2 depending on the source. A smaller magnitude 4.5 event near Perryton followed in 1974. And then, remarkably, close to nothing at that scale for decades, until the July 23, 2026 earthquake arrived and immediately took its place at or near the top of that entire list. When an earthquake shows up and instantly becomes one of the 4 or 5 most significant seismic events a region has produced in over 100 years, that is not routine background noise. That is an event that demands a real explanation. So here is the actual mystery, the one the USGS has explicitly said it has not yet solved. What caused this earthquake? The Texas Panhandle sits far from the edges of major tectonic plates, the boundaries where the overwhelming majority of the world's earthquakes originate, from the San Andreas Fault System in California to the subduction zones off the coast of Japan. This region is, geologically speaking, deep in the interior of a continental plate, an area that should be about as seismically quiet as anywhere in North America. Most Panhandle earthquakes, according to the National Weather Service office in Amarillo, occur near the boundary between 2 ancient underground geological features, the Amarillo Wichita Uplift and the Anadarko Basin, with fault lines running from just north of Amarillo into southwestern Oklahoma. These are old, largely dormant faults, remnants of tectonic stress from hundreds of millions of years ago, not the kind of actively grinding plate boundary you would find in California or Alaska. For faults like that to suddenly produce a magnitude 5.0 earthquake, something has to be adding new stress into a system that has mostly sat quiet for an extremely long time. This is where the investigation gets genuinely complicated, and where scientists are being deliberately careful not to jump to conclusions. 2 explanations are on the table. The first is simple natural tectonic activity, ancient faults finally releasing stress that has been slowly accumulating over an extremely long period, similar in principle to what we have covered on this channel happening along much larger, much more active fault systems elsewhere in the world. The second explanation is something called induced seismicity, earthquakes triggered not by natural geological forces alone, but by human industrial activity, specifically oil and gas operations. This is not a fringe theory. It is a well-established, peer-reviewed area of seismology. The mechanism works like this. When wastewater generated during oil and gas extraction is injected deep underground for disposal, it can increase fluid pressure along nearby fault lines, in some cases enough to reduce the friction holding those faults locked in place and allow them to slip. Oklahoma, directly north of the Texas Panhandle, is the textbook case study for this exact phenomenon. Oklahoma went from recording only a small handful of earthquakes above magnitude 3.0 per year in the early 2000s to recording literally hundreds per year at the peak of its induced seismicity crisis in the mid-2010s, a surge that state and federal scientists directly linked to a dramatic increase in wastewater injection volumes tied to oil and gas production in the region. When regulators there tightened restrictions on injection well volumes and locations, the earthquake rate measurably declined in the years that followed. That is a real-world example proving the mechanism is not theoretical. The problem, and the reason the USGS has not assigned a cause to the July 23rd earthquake, is that separating natural activity from induced activity in the Texas Panhandle is scientifically difficult for a very specific reason. Oil and gas development in that region began roughly in the 1920s, and seismic monitoring instrumentation sensitive enough to reliably detect smaller earthquakes did not really exist before that. Which means there is essentially no clean pre-industrial baseline of natural seismic activity in the region to compare against. Scientists cannot definitively say the fault was quiet before drilling began, because nobody was measuring it closely enough to know. The National Weather Service's own summary of the region's seismic history states plainly that this makes it genuinely difficult to prove or disprove a connection between oil and gas activity and the region's historical earthquakes. This earthquake, in other words, is not just a geological event. It is a genuine open scientific question, and researchers will likely spend months analyzing seismic waveforms, well data, and injection records in the surrounding area before they can say anything definitive about its cause. Now let us talk about what happens next, because the US does not just log an earthquake and move on. Their forecasting models immediately generate a probability outlook for what comes after a main shock like this one. For the July 23rd earthquake, the USGS placed the odds of one or more aftershocks reaching magnitude 5.0 or higher, strong enough to be damaging on its own, at less than 1% over the following week. However, their model also projected that smaller aftershocks are likely, estimating up to 5 aftershocks of magnitude 3.0 or higher within that same week, large enough for people nearby to feel but well below the threshold for any real damage. This is a completely standard part of how earthquake sequences behave. A main shock releases the bulk of the accumulated stress along a fault segment, but it rarely releases all of it evenly, and the surrounding rock continues adjusting for days or even weeks afterward, producing a gradually decaying sequence of smaller tremors as it settles into a new, more stable configuration. It is also worth understanding just how differently this event was handled compared to a similarly sized earthquake in a region without modern monitoring infrastructure. The USGS issued what is known as a green alert for this earthquake, their lowest tier, which specifically indicates a very low likelihood of significant fatalities or economic losses. That alert was generated almost immediately, using automated systems that combine the earthquake's magnitude, depth, and location with detailed models of regional population density and building types. This is the same infrastructure, built and refined over decades, specifically because the United States sits on multiple seismically active zones, from California's San Andreas system to Alaska's subduction zone to the New Madrid seismic zone in the central Mississippi Valley. The Texas Panhandle earthquake landed on top of a monitoring and alert system built for entirely different regions, and that system still worked exactly as intended within minutes, correctly assessing that this was a historically notable event without also being a life-threatening one. So is Texas suddenly becoming earthquake country? That is the honest question people are asking, and it deserves an honest answer. No, not in the way California or Japan is earthquake country. The Texas Panhandle remains, structurally, one of the most seismically quiet regions in the United States, sitting deep in the interior of the North American plate rather than along an active boundary. A single magnitude 5.0 earthquake, however historically significant for this specific region, does not rewrite the fundamental geology of the area. What has genuinely changed, and this is the pattern seismologists have documented across the central United States more broadly over the past 2 decades, is that regions with heavy oil and gas extraction and wastewater injection have seen their seismic activity increase in ways that cannot always be cleanly separated from natural background risk anymore. Oklahoma proved that human industrial activity can measurably raise a region's earthquake rate. Whether the exact same mechanism played any role in the Texas Panhandle on July 23rd is still an open question, one the USGS has been explicit about not yet answering. But the broader pattern, industrial regions in the middle of the continent experiencing earthquakes at rates their historical geology alone would not predict, is now well-documented science, not speculation. Here is what is actually useful to know if you live anywhere in this region. First, an earthquake of this size producing 0 reported injuries and no significant damage is not luck. It is largely a reflection of how the Panhandle is built: low-rise construction, wide-open spacing, and building stock that, unlike Venezuela's densely packed unreinforced structures we have covered before on this channel, was never going to be pushed to catastrophic failure by a magnitude 5.0 event at this depth. Second, if you are in the affected region and you felt this earthquake, the single most useful thing you can do is submit a Did You Feel It report directly to the USGS. That crowdsourced data is not just symbolic, it is actively used by seismologists to map shaking intensity in far greater detail than fixed instruments alone can provide, and it directly improves the models used to assess the next earthquake in the region. Third, given the USGS aftershock forecast, treat the possibility of smaller, felt aftershocks over the coming days as a normal, expected part of this sequence rather than a new cause for alarm, while still keeping basic earthquake safety habits in mind, securing heavy furniture, knowing your nearest safe space to drop and cover, even in a region that has not needed to think about that in generations. What makes this story genuinely interesting is not that a Texas earthquake killed no one and damaged nothing. Plenty of small earthquakes do that every single day around the world without making headlines. What makes it interesting is that it happened in a place where the entire baseline assumption is that earthquakes like this essentially do not happen, and it happened at a scale large enough that 2 separate government scientific bodies each independently classified it among the most significant seismic events the region has ever recorded. The investigation into exactly why is still open. Was it a slow, ancient fault finally releasing stress that had been building for centuries? Or was it stress introduced or accelerated by a century of oil and gas operations layered on top of a region nobody was carefully monitoring before industrial activity began? That is the actual scientific mystery, and it is the kind of question that takes seismologists months of careful analysis of waveform data, well records, and injection histories to even begin answering with confidence. This is also a reminder of something worth sitting with. Earthquake risk in the United States has never been confined neatly to the places people expect it: California, Alaska, the Pacific Northwest. The New Madrid seismic zone in the central Mississippi Valley, far from any plate boundary, produced a sequence of earthquakes in the winter of 1811 and 1812, so powerful that witnesses reported the Mississippi River briefly appearing to run backward, and modern seismologists still consider that zone capable of producing a major, damaging earthquake today, with essentially no warning, in a region most residents never think to prepare for. The Texas Panhandle is not the New Madrid zone, and this was not that scale of event. But it is part of the same broader lesson. The interior of a continent is not automatically safe ground, and the honest scientific position is to keep watching, keep measuring, and keep being willing to say we do not yet know, rather than rushing to a comfortable answer before the data actually supports one. We will keep tracking this story as the investigation develops, every aftershock, every USGS update, and whatever conclusion researchers eventually reach about its cause. Subscribe to Stellar Zone so you do not miss it, and leave that comment below. Did you feel this one, and where were you when it hit? Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. See you in the next one.